What's up, brother and sisters? Your brother G World 7_D. Now, these are two of the three books that Van Sertima did that follow up that came before Columbus. I want to say they came out in 1976. Is African Presence in Early America, and then there's Early America Revisited. And then he did one called Reply to My Critics. It was a third one. And this is back in the 90s. This one was done, I think this was done like in 96. This is Transaction Publishing. And this one was done in 98. And I believe this one was done in 95. Okay, 92. This is done in 92. This was done in 92. All right. So I mentioned before how Van Sertima was moving to direction how the original people of the Americas were so-called black. A lot of your Pan-Africans don't know nothing about this book, or a lot of them don't talk about this, or don't think people know about this, because I got these books back in the 90s, man. Actually, around the time when they came out. So, here we go. I'm going to go to page 230, because this is a good book, by the way. This is a good book. And I'm going to go right here. I think it's 230 I got to go to. Let me check, because this is a very good book. You see this little image that was out of Canada. That was found in Canada. Alright. But here we go. This is out of Van Sertima's book. Alright. It's called, right here, the summary. This paper lays emphasis on cranial remains in the ancient New World, which establishes the prehistoric presence of Africoid types in the Western Hemisphere. This evidence suggests, argues Clegg, that even before the Great Mongoloid Migration via the Bering Straits, a black element, variously designated by physical anthropologists as Proto-Negroid and Pseudo-Australoid, entered both the northern and southern halves of the American continent. Alright. The history of the ancient New World will remain complete and will not be fully understood until the presence of the black race as an integral part of it is first acknowledged by scientists and then brought to the attention of the lay public. In the effort to embark on the first step, this paper will narrowly focus on some cranial remains that suggest the prehistoric presence of black folk in the Western Hemisphere. The general history of early America is universally written in two phases, that of the pre-Columbian Indian native and that of the post-Columbian European colonization. Most scientists concur on the racial characteristics of the two major groups that confronted each other in the Western Hemisphere, as the first phase yielded to the second. The Indian or red man, is generally agreed, was of Mongolian stock with a broad head, straight black hair, broad and prominent cheekbones, and a broad and concave nose. The Caucasoid European was also broad-headed with a bleak skin, a prominent nose, and chin and hair that generally range from straight to wavy. Rarely considered in histories and treatises on the New World is the Negroid race. These long-headed, dark-skinned folk usually possess crinkled or wavy hair, a nose that range from broad to keen, and lips that are often fleshy. Many Negroid people who were imported by Europeans into the Americas during the early period of white colonization. Although scholars are gradually expressing a growing tolerance for historians who discuss the enslavement of black people in the world, any examination of the role of blacks in Americas prior to the slave trade and slavery is met with bitter resistance by many of the same savants whose allegiance to outmodel tradition far outweigh their pursuits of scientific accuracy. That goes with a lot of Negroes too. Alright, that goes for a lot of Negroes too. You hear them with Sarnetta. The self-hate them clowns had, because they don't believe that black folks had the intellectual fortitude to sail around the world. Before Western scientists began the universal suppression of the history of black people, several early scholars, primarily Latin American scholars, acknowledged and investigated evidence of ancient black presence in the Americas. Among those pioneers was Jose Melgar, Manuel Orozco, Ybarra, Rivera Palaco, I'm pronouncing these names wrong, and Jose Villacorta. In modern times, the one scholar who has synthesized the work of these and other scientists and brought a fresh approach to the history of the Western Hemisphere is Rutgers University anthropologist Ivan Van Sertima, a guy from Guyana. His book, They Came Before Columbus, The African Presence in Ancient America, is a landmark that firmly establishes the significant role that black folks played in the advancements of pre-Columbian New World civilization. The contributions of the foregoing scientists are immeasurable and are slowly forcing the intransigence of the academic world to bulge as the new revolutionary school of thought gradually rises from the blight of white supremacist propaganda. One certain indication of the impact of the new school on modern science is that many archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians are now listening to the arguments of a growing number of experts on African and American history and examining the evidence which confirms the presence of black people in America between 800 BC and 1400 AD, way before that anyway. The new school, however, has not yet focused on the presence of black people in prehistoric America, 40,000 BC to 6,000 BC. Neither early Latin American pioneers nor their modern disciples have given this subject much attention because they want to bury it. Yet, over the past century, a few distinguished authorities have meticulously recorded evidence in special reports and technical treatises that suggest that Africoids were the first inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere. By using the term Africoid, we are speaking herein of the Pygmanoid, the Australoid, and the Negroid peoples. Since it appears highly likely, if not absolute, that the foregoing subtypes have common ancestral roots that extend into prehistoric times and are probably traceable to the continent of Africa, we refer to these people as variants of the black or Africoid race. And when speaking of the foregoing variants as a whole, the term Africoid is used. The Pygmanoid, including Negritos, and Negrillos, are distinguished from the heretofore defined Negroid subtype mainly by the fact that the former are dwarfed people who rarely reach 5 feet in height. You see them in the Andaman Islands. The Australoid subtype, on the other hand, differs somewhat from both the Negroids and the Pygmanoids. They are generally dark-skinned, invariably black, with a broad, flat nose and fleshy lips, as are the latter two subtypes, but also possess a beetling brow ridge, a receding forehead, and hair that ranges from wavy to straight. Although the presence of Africoid people in prehistoric America is largely evidenced by cranial remains, most modern scientists ignore this and dismiss as preposterous the very possibility of such an early pre-Columbian population in the New World. Harold S. Gladwin, a distinguished pioneer in American anthropology, has summed up the present posture of the general scientific community concerning the subject, Man in Asia, I believe that book you wrote. It has been this negative attitude of mine, for instance, which has consistently refused to recognize the definite implications of many references of physical anthropologists to such types as Australoid or Negroid in the makeup of various Indian tribes, even though veiled by such qualifications as Proto-Negroid or Pseudo-Australoid. Terms such as these will be found only in technical papers or physical anthropology, but never in orthodox reconstruction of Native American history. We have concluded them here because we think they cannot fairly be ignored, and once you accept them as facts to be reckoned with, they turn out to be essential to an understanding of the problem, since they show that the Mongoloid people could not have reached North America before the time of Christ. Prehistoric Pygmanoids. The first of the early Africoids who reached the Americas may well have been the Pygmanoid subtype. Their presence, however, is mentioned here as a possibility rather than established fact because the supporting evidence is extremely sparse and inclusive. Gladwin wonders whether the Yaghan Terra del Fuego are of very ancient Pygmanoid origin. They are of surprisingly low stature, averaging about 5 feet, with some individuals never rising above 56 inches. They are found on the southernmost island or archipelago lying off the tip of South America, which is refuge area and therefore typical of present-day habitats of pygmalions around the world. In addition to this, Gladwin states that there are hazy suggestions of queer faces and traits which crop out occasionally along the eastern seaboard and other out-of-the-way places. Nothing can be pinned down, but just enough to make one wonder if there may not have been a few pygmy groups who stayed into the Americas in prehistoric times, and who were pushed off to the edge and the ends when the Australoid tide flowed in. In the same vein, Latin American historian Carlos Marquez notes that the Negroid figure frequent in most remote traditions of some American people. Certain tribes of Darins say that when the ancestors first arrived in the region, it was inhabited by small black men who soon afterwards retired to the forest, or the payas or the palaces of the Kunis origin goes back to a man and two women, one Indian and another Negro, who lived on the banks of the Tacuna. The ancient skeletons, which are very different from the red American races and have been found in various places from Bolivia to Mexico, doubtlessly belong to this race, the short pygmalion race. It is likely then that long ago youthful America was also a Negro continent, where the small black man recalled by the ancient Indians of Central America remnants of prehistoric pygmalion, who were the first people to reach this and settle the New World. It is impossible for us to be certain at this time, but the far-flung old world presence of sub-Saharan Africa, the Andaman Islands, the Malayan Peninsula, New Guinea, and the Philippines, of the Pygmalions certainly suggests that they have been a migratory people over the centuries who were probably as capable of reaching the prehistoric New World as were early Australoids, Negroids, and Mongoloids, whose ancient presence is now confirmed. It seems difficult to escape the theory, writes J. Rogers, one of the most foremost authorities on the history of black people, that in the most ancient times a Negrito race found itself cut off in the same way in the far north of both hemispheres. Northern Japan, Northern Europe, and Northern America are all inhabited by diminutive people with which hair, though straight, is black, and with dark Negro faces with a suggestion of a Mongolian. Rogers' theory is supported by the research of distinguished British Egyptologist Gerald Massey, who have written that the one sole race that can be traced among the Aborigines all over the earth or below is the dark race of a dwarf, a Negrito type, prehistoric Australoids. In contrast to the Pygmalions, there is a considerable evidence to suggest the prehistoric presence of Australoid subtypes in Americas. In fact, some scientists believe that these Australoids were the first inhabitants of the New World, which would mean that they reached the Americas at least 38,000 years ago, but perhaps as early as 70,000 BC. The eminent Harvard anthropologist Roland Dixon was one of the first scientists to detect Australoid characteristics in cranial exhumed from the prehistoric sites throughout the Americas, admitting that his conclusions were completely at variance in traditional and current theories. Dixon cautiously chose the term Proto-Australoid for the people he believed to have been the original inhabitants of the New World. The appellation served the dual purpose of saving Dixon's reputation and the pleasing the scientific community, which would not tolerate the suggestion that full-blown black Australians had reached prehistoric America. Racism playing in. It seems on the whole probable, Dixon wrote, that the Proto-Australian must have been one of the earliest, if not the earliest, type to spread into North American continent. On the Pacific coast in California and Lower California, it appears to contain the oldest stratum, characterizing as it does the cranial from the upper layers of shell sheets from the islands of Santa Catalina and San Clemente off the coast, and from the extinct Puricue, isolated in the southern tip of the peninsula of Lower California. It is moreover prominent among the ancient basket makers of northern Arizona, who represents probably one of the earliest peoples in the whole area. In the northeast, the type is of importance among the Iroquois and the southern Algonquian tribes, such as the Lenape. You know the Negroes, man. Gladwin largely concurs with Dixon's conclusion. The former speaks of Australoid skulls exhumed from early sites in Southern California, southwestern Colorado, southern Arizona, and the Texas Gulf Coast. Insists that certain vestigial traces in some modern people, such as the Periku of Lower California and Sura, a nearby Tiburon Island, confirm the prehistoric presence of Australoids in this part of the world. Most of the scientists who have acknowledged the presence of these Australoids point to the evidence that has been discovered in sites south of the present-day United States, primarily in South America. Significant amount of these finds is a calvarum that was exhumed from a fossiliferous bed in the high plateau of Ecuador and later turned over to two distinguished anthropologists, Louis Sullivan and Milo Hellman. Struck by a resemblance of the skull to those of native women of Australia, the two scientists noted that either we have, in certain parts of America, skeletal remains of a type basically related to those found also in Australia and Melanesia, and fundamentally differently racially from the prevailing Mongoloid American Indian types, or we have remarkably case of parallelism significantly detailed to deceive physical anthropologists of very wide experiences. Concurring with the foregoing scientists, anthropologist Arthur Keith has stated that this discovery does compel us to look into the possibility of a Pleistocene invasion of America by an Australoid people. The Ecuadorian Punan cavern is not an isolated discovery. British anthropologist A.C. Haddon notes that perhaps the oldest remains in South America of which we have sufficient information are those from the caves of Lagos Santa on the eastern border of the Brazilian highlands. These skulls are small, dolichocranial, very high, with a short and wide face, medium nose and orbit, and a very large palate, giving marked alveolar pragmatism. This is certainly an old type of skull which has affinity with various skulls from the Western Pacific and elsewhere. In the same vein, Gladwin adds that these Australoids have been found in association with extinct Afona and Punan in Pataco in Ecuador, in the Lagos Santa caves of eastern Brazil, and as a persisting factor in modern tribes in the southern half of the continent. Anthropologists Paul Rivet and A. H. King are similar opinion. Rivet, for example, notes that from Brazil to Tierra del Fuego on the Atlantic Scope in Bolivia and Peru, and on the high plateau of the Andes are traces of this distinct folk. Furthermore, Joseph Dinker, one of the first scientists to identify and define these prehistoric people, refers to them as the non-Mongoloid Paleo-American subrace, and Griffin Taylor, another distinguished anthropologist, has concluded that the foregoing evidence suggests that the first migration to Americas may have been a Batukudu or Australoid type. The prehistoric Negroids. The Negroid subtype of the Africoid race also appears to have migrated to prehistoric America, to the degree that the Negroid remains can be distinguished from those of Pygmalion and Australoid peoples. It appears that the Negroids follow the latter and were the first of the prehistoric peoples to reach the New World prior to the great Mongoloid migrations. Even among those scientists who recognize the prehistoric presence of Negroid cranial types in America, there is disagreement as to whether these early immigrants were full-blooded Negroids or an unnamed type, evidencing a strong Negroid strain. The late Harvard anthropologist Ernest Houghton was of a later opinion. I do not think there is sufficient craniological or other physical evidence to support the supposition that any group of Negroes or Negritos ever reached the American continent before coming of Europeans. BS. But I do think that some of the early strata of the American population show indication of having carried with them a solution from Asia a Negroid strain of blood. In sharp contrast to this, Taylor insists that existing cranial evidence surely indicates the presence in the far past of Negroid peoples in the American continent. Evidence of prehistoric Negroid people appeared to be widespread in the New World. Dixon refers to the cranial of this type that have been exhumed from very ancient strata in Arizona, northern Mexico, New England, and from the Turner Group mounds in Ohio Valley, engraved sites of the prehistoric Cisgrave people of Tennessee. Gladwin believes that these ancient folks settled much of the southern and eastern regions of the United States and mixed with many of the Australoids residents of the South and Southwest. He also believes that these Negroids were prehistoric Folsom people who appear to have been expert hunters and makers of fine flint spear points. Dixon and Taylor maintain that some of the prehistoric crania of South America evidence a definite Negroid presence on the continent. Taylor and Denneker also suggest that the wavy or frizzy hair living American Indians, such as the Correas of Mato Grosso, the Bacaras of the Xingu River, and some Arawaks is traceable to these prehistoric Negro immigrants. Conclusion. The foregoing evidence is by no means exhaustive, but lays the foundation for a far more detailed analysis of arguments presented and conclusions reached by distinguished authorities cited. An article of this nature raises a number of questions. However, some of these are beyond our present scope. Despite this, two questions are very compelling that a sentence or two must be devoted to partial answering to them. From what lands did the first Americans come? And what ultimately happened to the descendants of these prehistoric settlers? It is highly probable, though not absolute, that the prehistoric Africoids who appeared to have reached and settled the New World were descendants of very ancient black folks who migrated from Africa into Europe, Western Asia, India, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, China, and Japan. It appears, furthermore, that in scattered numbers, these Africoid pioneers, first of the Australoid and then of the Negroids, migrated up to the northern coast of Asia over the Bering Straits and therefore reached the New World perhaps as early as 70,000 BC. Wow. Okay, I could read the rest of this, but I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to stop right there. And now, I had talked about this book before, right? This is Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, African Presence in Early America. This is, I think, done in 1992. That was the original follow-up to They Came Before Columbus, which came out in the 70s. This was an updated version that came out in 92, and they reissued in 94, and then this one came out, Early America Revisited, and then he had a third one that followed up, Reply to My Critics. I had to dig deep and find these books because I haven't read them in a while, man. And I got these books in the 90s, all right? And I want to tell you this. Like I said, I come from a family full of educators. I can remember reading this stuff and seeing this stuff and then going to a lot of these black bookstores and they sit there and tell you that they talk about Egypt and West Africa and stuff. They left a lot of holes. That's what got me thinking and really early realizing that the original people in Americas were black. He just broke down three different groups. He was talking about the Pygmanoid, the Australoid, and Negroid. But those are usually European racist white terms defining short Negroes, stocky Negroes, and tall Negroes. Man, that's what all that mess is, man. Okay, but a lot of those are white people's classifications of breaking down various different black groups. So when you get these goofy Pan-Africans talking about, well, the scientists said this and that, they just reading straight from the article, not really breaking down what they're reading. All right. Van Sertima in that book talked about the various different blacks that were over here, the very different types of black, maybe the very different types of black and very different types of physical structures. But we always came in very different skin tone. All right. So the indigenous people in America were black. It's a picture, damn, it's in the South, maybe Mississippi, Louisiana, that shows a group of black people. I wish I have it in front of me. And one of the black women has a Australoid facial features, but woolly hair like the Tasmanian blacks. And it tells me that gene was still here. What they did was those blacks mixed in with other blacks. America was a black continent. I just read you that. And this is by Van Sertima, a former, I want to say he was an adjunct professor at Rutgers University He was from Guyana. You can look at some of his stuff online, and then he really grew from They Came Before Columbus. To what this book is totally different. This book added more information, more in depth, acknowledging that the original people in the Americas were black. He took it even further. All right, with this book, this one right here, he took it even further. That's not in publication no more, because it's done by Transaction Press. Transaction Press. This book is done by Transaction Press. Here it is. Transaction Press Publications. But his first book was done, I want to say by Carnegie House or something like that. That is still in publication. This is actually better because this is getting even more in depth, and this is talking about even more to black people. And then he also shows in his book that you see the various black people you have in Asia and stuff like that. China, images of very different black people outside of the Americas, man. He has it in this book. This is an excellent book. I remember I first read it back in the 90s, man. I read this book back in the freaking 90s, man. I tell you, I read this back in the 90s, ancient China. So this information is right in your face, man. But you're going to have to research and study it. But see, some of us have been so indoctrinated in thinking that we're just slaves from Africa. This is from the ancient Shang. This is China. You can obviously tell that's an image of a Negro. Alright, so, but he mentioned how the black people in Asia, the black people in Africa, and the black people over here in the Americas, man. And when you do your research, this is why I've been studying this stuff for years, man. And I can break this stuff down for you, man. I've been studying stuff for years, and I can tell you this now. We've been here. We're not descending no goddamn African slaves. I'm going to make that particularly clear. All right, my time's getting ready to run out, but I wanted to just highlight, show you some things. Look at that little mohawk on his head. Little mohawk on his head. All right. We've been here in Americas. We did not originate from no African slaves. We've been here in America. There were some slaves that were brought here. Some of my people were captured. This is the Americas. This is Egypt. Egypt. Look at his neck. The guy has his neck. The Americas. This is found in the Americas. This is Egypt. I told you these are the same damn people, man. Egypt, the Americas. Notice how he's in his posture. Egypt, that posture. The America, that postures. All right, brothers and sisters, man. The information's there. You're going to have to go want to study and research it. You're going to have to do that, man. You're going to have to do that. Because the Americas. Peru, Aheru, Egypt, the Americas. Look at their hands, legs, side, Egypt. Study your history, man. Our history is not coming here as no damn slaves. We were already here. This is our history. So when you hear these goofy people like Amawili Africa, Sarnetta, Jabari, they're jackasses, man. They don't know nothing. They're ignorant. They have not studied history, and they don't study cross-cultural Atlantic sailing. Okay, they cross-cultural navigation. They don't know nothing about that. They just think you just came over enslaved from Africa. Those are ignorant dudes, man. Do not listen to them jackasses. They're too stupid. All right, I'm telling you right here. Our people are aboriginal to this planet. That's just something that's an old book by Dr. Ivan Ben Sermon. All right, peace and love, brothers and sisters. It's your brother G Word. About to step out of here. I love you. Continue to do the research, man. That's the book, African Presence in Early America. And then I didn't show you nothing in this book. I just showed you this is the follow-up book to this is the original one from They Came Before Columbus, a follow-up. Then this one. And then he had one reply to my critics, the third one, which is a good one too. I don't have that out in front. I have to dig for it. All right, brother. Peace and love, man. Peace.